Hello. So today, I think we should go over a technique breakdown specifically in the context of looking at it as a replay through YouTube. I think that there are a lot of people out there who have videos of their own fights and of fights they like to watch, and they want to do a technical breakdown of what happened in an exchange or in a fight, but they feel like YouTube doesn't give you the tools you need. And in a sense, they're right. YouTube generally uploads a pretty inferior quality. You get bad frame rates from cameras, because people record these fights on their phones. And you get a lot of mess, fuzz, things you can't tell what's happening. But I think that if you are very careful about what you're looking at and you know some basic principles of editing, there are some things that can be learned. So the first thing I want to talk about is this one little exchange I have with Derek Ray back in Queens Court 2022 that I feel like is a great example of how to do a review of a particular exchange. So the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to watch the exchange. If it would load. Thank you. Cool. Done, right? Simple as. Two people come into a bind up in the high. I Zverk onto my right side, hit Derek in the arms. Right? That's what happened. Well, not exactly. We'll replay it again, get to about the point where we meet in the middle. And what I want to pay attention to here is a couple of things that you can learn from a frame-by-frame replay, even of this quality. So the first thing to point out is this is the problem with this quality of recording. Even though our blades aren't even really moving that fast, it's still faster than the frame rate of the camera recording it, which makes our blades invisible. It turns us into blurry little monsters where you can barely tell what's happening. Everything looks like you forgot your glasses. So useless, mostly. But there are still some things that you can pick up on. One, crossguard. And what I want everyone to pay attention to here is another principle, which is a kind of understanding of how recording works, which is that anytime blades are moving quickly, you can't see them because they're moving too fast and across too many different planes to be picked up by the recording. As you can see here, it looks like Derek has 3 hands, 2 bandanas, a couple of swords, and maybe holding a pommel disembodied in his left hand. That's because in this frame to this frame, the sword crosses all of this distance and it only has 2 or 3 frames to record it in. So it comes off looking like he's cloned himself. So, but when the swords make contact, what we see is this brief point where the sword is clearly moving around here, but it's staying in the same general area. This is important to take note of because this is showing you 2 things. One, it's showing you what it looks like on an individual frame when 2 blades meet, which is significantly more visible than when they're moving. Here, my blade's not really moving a lot. You can see it pretty easily. But the second we make contact, suddenly it's doing all kinds of crazy crap. So is his. This is how you know blade contact was made. But also, importantly, it's how you know no contact with anything else was made. As we'll see here in a second, when I throw my Zverkow and I hit, there's a brief moment, a brief frame here where you think, oh, I landed the cut. Well, where did I land the cut? It wasn't here. It wasn't here. It was here. And you can tell this is where I landed the cut because suddenly my blade goes from completely invisible to completely visible. And that's not a trick. Well, you can't see it here, I guess because Derek sort of lowers his hands and blocks it here. But this is the before, this is the after, and this is where contact gets made because the second my blade hits his body, it stops moving and the camera captures that moment in time as a solid-ish looking line. Conversely, you can see that Derek's blade is still moving. Even though it looks like it could be touching my hands, it could be stabbing me in the face, the fact that you can't see it means it's not holding still, and that means it hadn't made contact yet. But ironically, in this cut and dry exchange that might have looked very obvious on the offset, now isn't so obvious because I make contact here, and on the very next frame, Derek makes contact here. He throws a cut to my hand, and it couldn't be more clear that he's doing so because, again, his sword has stopped. It was moving, it's moving in that direction right towards my hand, and bam, it stops. Everything over here is still moving because this is where it has stopped. Make contact right here, right on my wrist. And after this, we just stop. Call was called. Nothing happened. So let's watch it again and see if we can spot where exactly Derek makes that hand shot that we saw. Suddenly, it's not so obvious what happened. Suddenly, you can see, right, as I'll pause it here, Derek goes from having thrown an attack on my left side, his right side, to throwing a kind of tiny, maybe not super well rotated Unterhau right into my wrist. Now, we could argue all day as to whether or not that has a very sufficient amount of rotation on it. But the simple fact here is that based on this frame by frame, I can see a hit that at full speed is almost completely invisible and makes no noise. There are no other indicators that this attack even happened and nobody else saw it. And it's because of the crappy frame rate that I can tell you exactly when it made contact. So what I will do now is I'm going to move forward a little bit here. And we're going to look at another exchange where this doesn't happen. So this is a one-handed cut. People see these not so very often. I think they're a little cheeky. I'm the one who does it. You can make fun of me all you want. But something that we can do here is we can look at what exactly happens frame by frame in this one-handed cut. If I move forward a little bit to when I throw it, which I believe is right about here, I'm going to back it up. I gesture forward with my body, threatening an attack. But instead of moving forward, I kind of let go with my right hand. And I start moving, pretty much not moving anywhere. I just reach forward with my body and I try to throw that little cast and cut. Now, one thing I want you to look at is edge alignment. As this cut is coming down, you can see that the cross guard is pointed directly where it should be pointed. It is directly in line with where the cut is going. Because they're together, you can say that this cut has edge alignment. But there's something interesting to look at. The second the blade makes contact, the cross guard has turned 90 degrees. Here, it's lined up properly, and it looks like it's about 8 inches longer than it is due to camera effects. One frame, it's perfectly aligned. The next frame, it's completely wrong. It is completely flat. So, what happened? Was the cut properly aligned, or was it completely flat? Well, the answer is that it was aligned when it made contact, but because there's only one hand on the sword, it rotates the exact moment it makes contact and flips flat. This is something that's important to know whenever you're reviewing footage, because you have to know the difference between something that lands flat and something that's thrown flat. Because this only looks like it lands flat due to inevitable mechanics of the sword, aka the second the edge touches Derek's arm, it can't stay that way. It has to flatten out, otherwise it would hurt. The flexibleness of the blade, which we use to keep ourselves safe, is the reason that this happens. So you got our exact moment of impact right here. It's flat there, but we know based on this it was edge on. And then it follows through. Cut happens. Let's look at another exchange. Nope, went too far. So we got something similar to before, which is that we come to a bind, and I throw a right Zverkow low. Derek attempts to parry, but is not there in time. And we're looking for when does the contact get made. We come into this bind. Derek throws his cut. He makes edge on contact with my crossguard right here, but just because of the angle of the camera, it's sitting right above my right shoulder, doesn't quite make contact. The next frame, it's already going back up, and it's parried, right? So I throw that Zverkow. Derek's blade actually, at this point, is pushed up by my hands on the flat and almost hooks over and touches me on the top of the head. And right here is where I'm throwing this Zverk. So what we're looking for is, was this flat? Was this edge? We can't see the crossguard behind my hands, but what we're looking for is that moment of impact. Here, the sword's invisible. Here, you can kind of see it here. Maybe that's impact. No, this is impact. Right here, you can clearly see the entire blade standing still for at least the length of this frame. Now, if you look closely, this is my crossguard. This is my crossguard peeking out from in front of my right hand, which means the crossguard pointing this way is directly in line with the edge, which means that it's directly in line with the path of the sword and directly in line with Derek's head. Meaning that from here to here, we have the travel of the blade, we have the impact of the blade, and we have the follow-through parry, which I don't do very well because I get hit. This Zverk was aligned, edge on. Now, if we look at the follow-up, we see something different. We see this point of impact. This looks flat, but that doesn't necessarily mean it was flat, just like with the one-handed example earlier. But we can see right here, this frame, these crossguard is already pointed in the wrong direction and starts to turn in the air before contact is made. So this is the frame before contact. This is the frame of contact. You can very clearly see it's rotating in the wrong direction and landing flat. It never pulls out of that. This is how you can determine edge alignment with a YouTube replay, even a crappy one like this. So if you guys have footage that you want to review and you want to find out what really happened, but you think that it's too poor or it's too slow or you just can't tell what's going on, this is how you figure it out. All right? There you go. So here's another expression of how we can use our review footage to figure out whether or not something landed. Based on what we talked about before, what we're always looking for in an exchange is that point of contact where the frame picks up a solid image of the sword. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to play an exchange where you can't tell whether or not something landed. If I hit play there, Chinny comes in, I throw his Zverk. Did that land? Well, it's kind of hard to tell. The idea here is that someone threw an attack at my head, I cron parried up, I'm going in for that Zverkow, but at this exact point, you can see Cheney is very clearly putting his force of his hands directly into my lead hand, which makes a Zverk very hard to throw because your structure collapses immediately while throwing it. So we know from looking at this before that when a sword is traveling, it's basically invisible. And we can tell right about here that actually right about this second, it appears as though my edge is not aligned, but it sort of maybe comes back around to being aligned here. But again, what we're looking for is we're looking for that solid piece. Now this appears to be the closest thing to a point of contact that we get. It's moving, it's moving, it's moving a little slower because it's being interrupted. It's still moving, it's still mostly invisible, and bam. Clear as day picture of what's going on. Even the tip that back here that's past the target is not moving. Now, first thing to look at is point of contact. Did contact happen? It looks like yes. At the very least, my sword touched Stephen Cheney's upper right shoulder, maybe arm. However, there's something important to look at here. Crossguard. From here, it looks as though my crossguard goes from here, where it's maybe sticking up a little bit, comes straight in and runs out of the way into a flat plane. And my edge alignment is completely ruined. Now, unlike with the one-handed example, there is a reason why my hand does this, and it's because it's currently being shoved. If you look carefully at my hand here, as we go forward and my hands rise, I'm forcibly being rotated, if you can even tell by my knees, to my left, my inside line. You can see right from here, I'm more or less square with my hips. As I throw that Zverk, suddenly I'm forced to over-rotate, and I'm pushed out of the way right here. My hands go straight up in the air, all the momentum is taken out of my cut, and most importantly, it's turned flat in the wrong direction. So this is important to look at because it's an edge case. If you use the stuff we talked about earlier, you might think, oh, there you go. Clear contact, but maybe a little flat. But if you're not paying attention to what's happening before and after, and you're not paying attention to the intent of each of the fighters, you can be misled a little bit. You could look at this and think, oh, contact was made, 2 points me. And you'd be wrong. Because if you pay attention to the hands before and after, you would know exactly why my cut is horrible. You would also notice that right about here, Cheney is pushing my arms off to my left side. He's not exactly able to get it with his left arm, and he's trying to pommel me in the face, but my arm's in the way. In this rule set, going out of bounds was a -1 point. Cheney kind of stops himself. We both go out of bounds more or less at the same time. And right about here, after he's done basically pushing me out of the ring, I disconnect. And as I'm trying to disconnect, he throws a sneaky little Zverkow right here. So, again, going off all the rules that we've talked about before, is his edge line here? Yep. Here comes the travel. It does some funky wobbling as it's coming in, maybe not 100% perfect, but right about here, still 100% in motion, edge aligned with my head, bam, point of contact. We know where the edge was, we know where the edge was going, we see my head, and we see a perfectly still blade right there, point of contact. Immediately after, it bounces off, and we do some other things. I throw a countercut, and another perfect example of, did I hit him? Yeah, a little bit. Hands were in the way, guard was in the way, and at the end of the day, none of this matters because we were both out of the ring 2 swings before that. But this is an example of how you break down an exchange that's not confusing in the other ways, in that you are just trying to figure out what happened. This is confusing because you have to be paying attention to the whole person as you're reviewing the exchange. So one more time, we're going to do the whole thing again and pay attention to everything that happens. Cut, 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 cut. All happens really fast. It's all out of bounds. It's all out of tempo. None of it counts for anything. And I will argue, that is Cheney pushing me out of the ring, ruining my cut, throwing a counter cut to my head, and in a lot of ways ruining my own counter cut as well. So I think in this case, the exchange, all called perfectly. So this is an exchange that's pretty important when it comes to interpretation, and that is the question of whether or not a stab landed. Now, unlike with cuts, stabs have a lot more stopping time, which means that there's a lot more time where the blade is not moving and you can see it very clearly in frame, but that does not always mean it's very obvious when it lands, especially against a mask. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to watch this exchange, and I want you to look for a stab that Cheney throws to my head. So as you can see, he throws a stab, and it looks like my brain just shuts down. I sit there, and you can see me indicating it here in the end because I felt it. But if you watch the footage, well, it's very hard to see. That stab right there landed? Very hard to tell. But if you slow it down and we go frame by frame, we can see how exactly it happened. So this is the start. As you see, he's coming forward. He's flicking his tip in. The sword is moving so quickly you can't see. And then, bam, right there. Look, you go from a completely invisible sword, one frame, where you not only see it perfectly clearly in the air, but you see this bend right here. Right there. And then it bounces off. So he comes in, bam, lands it, sticks it right, looks like right about in my top shoulder, maybe in the neck a little bit, as I push it out of the way off to my right side. And just like that, I throw my Zverkow as the afterblow, he parries it, and at this point, I've done my due diligence as far as I have considered as a fighter. I've thrown my afterblow, I've defended myself. He whacks me a couple times because he kind of thinks the exchange is still going, but it's perfectly okay because immediately after I try to, give him the point for it. But this is a tough one to see. Very tough one to see. But if we use our frame by frame, we can see what other people can't. Extension, a stick, a bend in the sword, and then the parry afterwards. What we're going to look at now is a stab that is much more obvious. So we're going to watch the exchange first. Looks like a pretty clear stab, right? Let's watch it again and see what indicators show us that. Yeah, 2 exchanges, 2 little cuts there, nothing happens. And then right here, shouldn't have done that. I go for my stab. So I'm lunging in, I'm coming forward, the blade's invisible, the blade's invisible, the blade's invisible. And now, maybe here, maybe there, that's really the impact point. As you can clearly see here, it's still moving forward. It still hasn't made proper contact. And this is exactly what you need to be looking for when you're looking for stabs. Because right now you can see my blade, and that might make you think it stopped moving. But you can tell very obviously from the motion of my hands, it has not stopped moving at all. So where does it actually stop? Here. This is the point of impact. And as you can see, you know it happened because there's a little bit of bend in my sword. At this point, the bend only gets worse as Cheney tries to parry me out of the way. That also explains why my hands go from perfectly aligned here to 90 degrees in the opposite direction. But this is important for figuring out when stabs actually land and if they actually land. Because sometimes the old trick of, is the sword visible, can be a little bit misleading. It can be a little bit difficult to tell when exactly it happened unless you look at the bend. No bend, bend. This is the point of impact, right here. So that's how you can tell. Contrasting that with the last stab that Cheney got off on me, there's the same indicators, but it's significantly harder to spot at full speed. So we watch it one last time. It looks obvious when you watch it, but really it had the exact same monikers of the one that was landed on me. That's the importance of doing this kind of technical review. Okay, so this is the last thing I feel like is worth reviewing, and that is a wrestling exchange. These don't happen too much, but it's important to always note that there are a couple of things that you can see in a frame-by-frame replay that can be misleading. And the first is momentum and balance. Now, obviously, when we watch something like this, it's very easy to tell which direction I'm going. But what is not always easy to tell is why I do this with my foot. If you watch this entire thing where my foot starts and how it ends, what you pretty clearly see is me taking a very deep, very committed motion that takes me all the way to here. I go from all the way here to here. And what that's supposed to be showing you is the momentum of my step. It's sometimes not very clear, if you would look at a frame like this, that I can't just put my foot down. You might think, what are you doing? Why are you so far forward? Why are you continuing to make this step when you don't have to? But the reality is, I do have to. All of this commitment forward here has not been stopped by my front foot alone. And it can only be stopped by this follow-up step here and Cheney trying to pummel me in the head. So you have to make sure that when you're reviewing a grappling exchange, you pay attention to momentum, because especially with stuff like this, Cheney is trying to pommel me in the head. However, my momentum is coming very, very quickly forward. And the second we get here, we both stop dead. I don't know if you've ever seen that like fun little experiment where if you take 2 fans and you point them at each other and then you let go of like a piece of paper, it goes straight up. Because when 2 things with momentum that are going forward meet in the center and they clash, they can't go through each other. They go straight up. Now, I could theoretically go down, but because we have legs, we prevent that from happening. So that's where our momentum goes. It clashes here and it goes straight up. And the reason I know that Cheney does not get this pommel off is because his sword goes straight up. His body goes straight up. Everything goes straight up, all the way onto his toes and when he leaves the ground. The reason this is important to know is because the entire time that this is happening, there is not a single frame of downward force on his sword. Not until here, where it goes off to the side. Now, at this point, Cheney then takes both of his hands and he takes complete control of my right arm, my sword arm. So right now my arm is being hugged by both of Cheney's arms. And as a result, I know that I'm about to die. So I try to circle around to the back. As long as I'm on Cheney's back, he theoretically can't beat me to death as easily. I do a little stupid thing here where I grab a bunch of dumb places and I don't do anything smart, but critiquing my own wrestling is for later. What's important is to watch the path of this pommel. Now, Cheney realizes that I'm going for his back, so he attempts to pivot. And he gets right to about here where he raises his sword up in the air, and he's right about to bring it down on my poor undefended skull. But at this exact moment, I dip him like the world's worst salsa dancer. And because of that dip, once again, like before, this pommel never really drives into my head. It simply gets anchored to the body and goes everywhere the Cheney's body goes. You could maybe say this is a strike, but it's not really doing a whole lot. Plus, he's in the act of falling right this second. Now, Cheney, being the far superior grappler than I am, actually turns out of it very nicely. He goes from almost being thrown right here to facing the other direction. He pulls me over his hip, nearly trips me. But at this point, we get right to the edge of the map. I've still kind of got his back, but he's got his hand wrapped around my head, which happened all the way back here when he went for that pommel. And as a result, he basically is in a position to hip toss me, but doesn't because my momentum kind of pulls us both forward. We're both just trying not to fall out of the ring. And the second we get to here, they call halt. Right? So the question of, did Cheney ever have the opportunity to pommel me in the head? Not really. The opportunity was there, but the downward motion and the strike never really came. Not to mention the fact that body positioning wise, there was never a great situation where any kind of force could be delivered. So that's how you look at grappling exchanges. When everybody's tied together, it's probably the one point at which you can see the most that's going on. It's very abundantly clear what's happening here, but what you need to pay attention to is momentum, weight, and balance. Otherwise, you might look at a situation like this and assume I'm about to be thrown like a rag doll. But if you're not understanding what exactly happened before this, here, you don't understand that right now Cheney's momentum is driving him so hard to the left and forward that he doesn't really have the ability to stick out his right leg and just throw me. He instead has to use both his legs, and specifically his left leg, to just stop himself from falling over here, and then I have to use my right leg to stop from being thrown out of bounds. We both stop ourselves, and the exchange ends. So we just watch it one more time. The initiation, the wrap, taking the back, the attempted throw, the attempted counter throw, and then the stop before it's all over. No exchange. As cool as it all was, and as cool as any one of those individual things would have been, nothing happens. So there you go.